As Chip said, the PowerPoints will be made available to everybody so that they can look at some of the quotes that we've been talking about. And I understand that looking at some of these things, especially if it's a first exposure to thinking about reasoning with people in our society in this way, can be a little overwhelming at first. There's a lot of things to take in and to process. But I hope that one of the biggest takeaways you guys have been having from this is that there are emotional reasons for unbelief. And rather than being distracted by somebody who comes up with this really complicated argument why they don't believe in the Bible, or this really intimidating rhetorical question that they think discredits the existence of God, that we have the instincts to not always be distracted by those questions or those arguments, but to be discerning that oftentimes there's some emotional reason for unbelief propelling these arguments. And so, good questions to ask people. Is the PowerPoint not? I have not put it up there. I don't know. Some good questions to ask people, though, would be, is there something that the Bible teaches that you don't like? And in asking that question, you might find that all of those arguments that they have against the Bible are really just a veil to cover up for some kind of thing that they just really hate that the Bible says, and I want nothing to do with this. There's one time when I was at a Starbucks in California having a Bible study with somebody, and there was a guy that kept looking over at us while we were having the study. And he asked us to leave the Starbucks. And I said, is it because of how loud we're talking, or is it because of what we're talking about? And he said, it's really because of what you're talking about. I don't want to have anything to do with this garbage. And I told him, well, we're going to keep doing our study. And we did our study, and then when the guy I was studying with left, I went over to the guy and I said, did you have a bad religious experience? And he just vomited for 40 minutes about how, not literally, about how bad his upbringing was and how hypocritical his parents were. And any arguments he may have had about why he hated God and hated the Bible, the deeper discussion was your bad religious experience. Recently, I was talking to somebody who had fallen away, and my question to him was, what do you miss most about being a Christian? And rather than just dealing with all of these apologetic kind of arguments, a big takeaway that I hope we have from this is to try to pinpoint the emotional causes of what's happening. And when you find what those are, to trace them down, and certainly there's a time to address the actual questions. But I'm reminded, and this is what the first passage we began with on Friday night, in John chapter 10, verse 10, where Jesus says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I come that they may have life and have it abundantly. If you believe that whatever the Bible says is true, like gravity is true, this verse is true. If somebody doesn't have Jesus as their shepherd, there are things that are being stolen and killed and destroyed in their life. And Jesus would appeal to people by saying, I can reverse those things. I can give you everything that you actually need, but you have to trust me as your shepherd. And so we've been talking about everybody's universal need for meaning. If Jesus isn't your shepherd, your meaning in life will be stolen, killed, and destroyed. If Jesus is not your shepherd, all of the reasons that you're concerned with morality are not going to be substantive at all. If Jesus is not your shepherd, you do not have hope, in the deepest sense that we could talk about that. And that's just true like gravity is true. And so if we take our need for hope and we compare how would a secular-minded person find hope versus the biblical worldview, and we just place these arguments side by side, we can see which one qualitatively matches our design, what we most need in life. And everybody, doesn't matter what your worldview is, everybody lives every present moment in view of the future. So if we've talked about our need for meaning, looking back to my origins, now we're looking forward to our need for hope. If you've got a really bleak outlook towards the future, it's going to affect how you look at the present. If you've got a really bright outlook towards the future, it's going to affect how you look at things in the moment. And there's a lot of clear markers in our society right now that there's a lot of hopelessness. And there's some evidences of this that I'll put up here, one of them being declining birth rates. When a society is less and less interested in having children, oftentimes that's connected to people having a lack of hope for the future. Suicide rates, you can go look up all the statistics of this. Do you know which demographic, which group of people suicide rates have increased the most with? Are women, younger women. And one of the reasons for that is connected to social media. Nobody's going to post on social media the times that they're the most angry with their family or the times that their house is the messiest. So if you're scrolling, you're seeing everybody else's life be absolutely perfect. I'm not as beautiful as this person. My family's never as happy as what these people are always presenting themselves to be. And it's not how they are all the time, but if that's all you're looking at, you're comparing yourself to that, and you start to have a lot of depression because of it. Another evidence is increasing SSRI rates, anti-anxiety, depression medication, and I'm not at all saying that everybody who's on these things does not have biblical hope. That's not my point in bringing that up. But I'm saying that the increasing use of these things widespread across the United States is a piece of evidence of a lack of hope. So, if our society is not doing a great job of instilling hope in people, and there's a lot of people that seem to be very hopeless, what would the secular approach to hope be? How would a secular person try to figure out, okay, this is how I look at my future. This is what's going to happen to me after I die. And so Catherine Osmond wrote a book called Grace Without God. And in the book, she's describing how she meets all of her deepest needs without God in her life. And in part of the book, she goes on these different interviews where she's interviewing different atheists, and she's finding out how they find meaning and hope and purpose in life without God. And she's interviewing a professor from the Claremont College in San Diego, and the professor says this to her. You need to tell your kids that you're a secular humanist and tell them what that means, he said. You need to say, we believe in making the world a better place. We believe in evidence over faith. We believe in reason as a way to address problems. We believe in helping others because that's what makes the world better for everybody. This is what we believe. If you have a thing that you believe in that ends with an ism, like Marxism, Buddhism, pantheism, the ism means that it's something that you trust in. You trust in Marx, so Marxism. You trust in what Buddha said, so Buddhism, so on and so forth. What is humanism? Secular humanism means that we trust in human beings. We trust that we will be able to answer all of the conundrums and quandaries and problems. We think that we can end world hunger. We think that we can solve injustices that exist in the world. And so if we just pull together and bind together and put all of our resources together, we can make the world a better place. And my hope is that after I die, I've made some contribution onward and upward that everything's going to be a lot better. To which I would say it is extremely naive to believe that you will actually do this. You just give it a few years and you wait until some kind of world war happens or some kind of terrible injustices are revealed, and all the things that you've been putting all of your effort into, you're going to find that you're not making even close to a dent in these things. H.G. Wells wrote a lot of different kinds of books. He wrote The Time Machine, War of the Worlds. He wrote a 2-volume book on the history of the world that was very popular, but people wanted him to strip it down, so he then made a 1-volume, still 1,000 pages or something, on a brief history of the world. And in that book, after World War I, and you understand that after World War I, they didn't call it World War I. They weren't expecting a sequel. And so they called it the Great War at the time. But after World War I, H.G. Wells wrote this: Can we doubt that presently our race will more than realize our boldest imaginations, that it will achieve unity and peace, it will live the children of our blood, and lives will live in a world made more splendid and lovely than any place or palace or garden that we know, going on from strength to strength in an ever-widening circle of adventure and achievement? What man has done, the little triumphs of his present state, and all this history we have told, form but the prelude to the things that man has yet to do. So he thought, after the Great War, like we've gotten our killing out of the way, where it's onward and upward from here, and he's got a lot of optimism in this book that he wrote in 1922. He has a lot of optimism that everything is going to be great. But what happens in World War II? 23 years go by, and there's a lot more ability to take pictures of concentration camps. There's more ability to record videos of the kinds of things that happened. What happens to a man who thought, we've gotten the killing out of our system, we're gonna have this great utopia of a future, and then this happens? And I'll tell you that for young people who think that you're going to make a huge difference with social justice and you're going to make a huge difference with climate whatever stuff that's all about, if you think you're going to make some huge dent and you're going to save the planet for the future and stuff like this, you just wait. Give it a couple of years. Give it 20 years, and you'll see that all these hopes, all these things that you were wanting to contribute in the world are going to evaporate. The last book that H.G. Wells wrote is called The Mind at the End of Its Tether. And in the book, he says this: the cold-blooded massacres of the defenseless, the return of deliberate and organized torture, mental torment, and fear to a world from which such things had seemed well-nigh banished, has come near to breaking my spirit altogether. Homo sapiens, as he's been pleased to call himself, is played out. Do you know what a lot of young people get attracted to? Our social movements. If we join this cause, if we have this banner on my social media thing so everybody knows I stand with this thing or that thing, and if I'm part of a movement, then we are contributing to the betterment of the future. And H.G. Wells, I think, if he could be resurrected right now, I think he would say, you're just naive. You just haven't lived long enough to know that any contributions you're going to make are, maybe you'll help a group of people for a period of time. And certainly there would be some good things about seeking to do that. But if your worldview says that there's going to be a solar flare one day and everything's going to be destroyed and there's no consciousness, what's the point? Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 15 says, what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Did you ever take a psychology class in college? Did you ever find that in the psychology classes, they can tell you what's crooked in you? They understand that there's something lacking in you, but how many of those classes have the ability to actually transform you? The world can look at injustices in society and go, there's something that's crooked, there's something that's lacking, and they can maybe in some ways diagnose some of the problems, but it doesn't have the ability to solve all of the problems. There are things that are so baked into the way that the world is after sin entered the world that would suggest that you're never going to ultimately make this into a utopia. Imagine for a moment that you were on an airplane and the engines had a bird strike, and so you're coasting for 7 minutes. You know you got 7 minutes and you're all going to crash and die. And you go, well, I got 7 minutes on this airplane. I think I am going to use the restroom. And so you go to the restroom and you go into the bathroom, the little door things, and you never know which way to open it. Is it in or out or whatever? So you get into it, and then you close it, and that's when the light's supposed to turn on, and it doesn't turn on, and you're so frustrated about this. So you go to the steward human, because you're not supposed to say stewardess. So you go to the steward human, and you say, hey, steward human, the light's not working. We got to fix the light. And the steward human is going to go, whoopee-doo. We're going to crash and die. Why does this matter? So if you're a secular person who believes that we're all going to crash and die one day, why do you care about making a difference in this world? I'm glad that you do, by the way, but your worldview says that all of this is going to be forgotten and it won't ultimately matter anyways. And so that's one problem with this. But I'm going to bring up, you remember when we talked about our need for meaning, and when people try to find their meaning in having lots of fun and helping people and relieving suffering and things like that, how that worldview can't apply to everybody. This hope of trying to leave the world a better place in like manner can't apply to everybody either. So again, if you've got a worldview that can't apply to everybody, it's not a good worldview. So I like this quote from Timothy Keller, where he says this: "Imagine how ludicrous it would have been to sit down with a group of early 19th century slaves and say, 'There will never be a judgment day in which wrongdoing will be put right. There is no future world and life in which your desires will ever be satisfied. This life is all there is. When you die, you simply cease to exist. Our only real hope for a better world lies in improved social policy. Now, with these things in mind, go out there, keep your head high, and live a life of courage and love. Don't give in to despair.'" By the way, are the improved social policies a good thing? Absolutely. But what the argument here is that if your worldview says it's all going to crash and burn anyways, what's the big picture reason why you're concerned with this stuff anyways? You're not making an ultimate contribution to anything because it's all going to crash and burn. Now, imagine if you could go to some slaves in the 1800s. Do you think it would be more compelling to them to say this idea? There's no judgment day, there's no wrongs that are going to be set right, all that sort of thing. So put your hope into changing society, things like that. Do you think that's going to be more appealing to them? Or, and have you ever thought about this before, where did the slaves learn about Jesus in the Bible? Have you ever thought about that question? It was from their slave masters. There's a book that Martin Luther King carried with him. There's two books he carried with him all the time: the Bible and a book called Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman was a Baptist minister in the 30s. His mom was a slave in Georgia. And the beginning of the book has Howard Thurman talking with a man from India. And the man from India is accusing Howard Thurman of just rolling over and just adopting the religion of the ones that subjected them to great slavery. And the man from India, his perception of this is that you guys are just very weak people to go along with this Jesus in the Bible that your enslavers taught you about. And so from that point on, the rest of the book shows why Jesus was so compelling even to slaves when they were hearing about Jesus through the lips of hypocritical people. And his argument was that Jesus was an oppressed minority. Jesus was in the Roman Empire, and he was harmed and crucified by people that had a lot more authority. And so even when these people were hearing through the lips of these hypocritical people these stories about Jesus, it was so compelling to them. Do you know what wouldn't have been compelling to them? Is this. There's no God, there's no judgment, there's nothing like that, but you just have to go strive for better social justice and all this sort of thing, which again is good if those things happen, but your worldview doesn't support you doing those things, you see. All right, that's the first approach to a secular person having hope, is I want to make the world a better place. You're naive and your worldview, it doesn't make sense in your worldview. Here's another approach though, is that you've got to accept death as a natural part of life. And I'm going to show you a couple things that show this. And I'll tell you, this is very influenced by pantheistic religion, but it's not couched in terms of pantheistic religion. This is the thing that if you read the more recent philosophers that are skeptical, this is going to be the thing that you're going to start hearing more and more in our society. But Catherine Osmond, in that same book, Grace Without God, she has this moment in the book where she's looking out her window of her daughter's room across the street from this church building. And Grandma had died recently. And Catherine Osmond doesn't believe that there's any afterlife, things like that. And the daughter's asking, what's happened with Grandma? Will I ever see her again? And this is a moment where Catherine Osmond, this is what the quote I'm going to show you is what she thought to herself but did not say to her daughter, because her daughter wasn't ready for this. But this is what she thought to herself. Our bodies decompose, falling back into the earth, merging with all other matter that makes up our planet. In the future, our decomposed bodies might provide nutrients to the trees. Someone might hang a swing from one of the trees, or sit beneath the shade of its leafy branches, or make a painted horse from its wood. Isn't that nice? She went on to say, I didn't want to scare her with the concept of our eventual oblivion. So she didn't have the heart to tell her that in the moment. But here's your hope. You get to feed a tree. That's pretty cool, right? And by the way, Lion King, in this great conversation that Mufasa and young Simba have with one another, remember when Mufasa says, everything you see exists together in a delicate balance. As king, you need to understand that balance and respect all the creatures, from the crawling ant to the leaping antelope. So son, respect everything. And his son's got a good question. He says, but Dad, don't we eat the antelope? Fair question. Dad's got a great response to this, though. Yes, Simba, but let me explain. When we die, our bodies become the grass, and the antelope eat the grass, and so we are all connected in the great circle of life. And you have that song about the circle of life and all that sort of stuff, and it's beautiful that we're just going to die, and we're going to be disintegrated, and we're going to feed other animals and trees and all this sort of thing, and it's just wonderful. We have to accept death, embrace death. It's just a natural part of life. It's just what happens. What are some problems with that perspective? If Catherine Osmond is really concerned about what's going to happen to her remains feeding a tree, and somebody's going to make a cute little, swing thing that kids will enjoy, and I get to be part of that. That's me in that. That's kind of cool. One problem with this is that if you're really going to put that much stock in what happens to your remains, you don't have any control with what happens to your remains. What if you feed a tree and somebody makes a baseball bat out of it and puts a bunch of barbed wire on it and kills a bunch of people? You don't have control over any of it. Or what about when Simba and Mufasa, this conversation that they have with one another, isn't it the case that Mufasa actually dies in a place that grass doesn't even grow? Doesn't he die in some kind of valley when he gets stampeded on by? He's not going to feed any grass that the antelope are going to eat. If what really matters to you is what happens to my remains, and you become a tree, what if it burns down? What if somebody cuts it down because they just want to cut a tree down because they're mean and all that? You have no control. Here's another problem with this. There's no final justice. If this is really your perspective, there is no ultimate justice, which is ironic because a lot of people that cry for justice are the very people who don't believe that there is ultimate justice. Look at this quote. No matter what you choose to believe or what good or evil actions you take in life, we all end exactly where we began, as stardust, like a drop of water falling back into the ocean. That, my friends, is the real horror. How can you, on the one hand, cry out for justice, and then on the other hand say, but there's no difference between Jesus and Hitler, ultimately? Final problem with this perspective is that as much as you try to tell yourself that death is just a beautiful part of accepting what happens in life, we all know instinctively that death is still an enemy. In 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about Jesus has to reign until he's put all of his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. Do you remember during COVID when they had on the news networks, they had the COVID death counter? And it was how many people have died. How many of you looked at those numbers and went, wow, just a beautiful thing? It's just such a beautiful thing. I mean, this is just the natural course of life. Nobody's going to look at it that way. You instinctively know that death is an enemy, and there's something that you would like to have defeat it, but you don't know what that is. And so you have to almost kill part of the way you think to accept that death is just a natural, beautiful part of life. But this is the perspective that's becoming more common in our society right now. And so I hope to leave the world a better place. You really won't, and it's going to crash and burn anyways in your worldview, so what's the point? I hope that I can feed a tree, and you've got no control over these things. Death is not a beautiful part of life. So what's the biblical perspective? The biblical approach to hope, if there's one passage that in my mind is one of the most concise passages in all the Bible to talk about this, is 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of the archangel and the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. Notice that the last part, we will always be with the Lord. What's the story of the whole Bible? That God created everything perfect. God was in union with man. Sin separated that union with man. And throughout the Bible, God is trying to draw nearer and nearer to people through the tabernacle, through the temple, eventually in the person of Jesus. And he keeps drawing closer and closer and closer until one day Jesus died on the cross and the veil was ripped in half. That allows God's presence to now go out to everybody. The really quick synopsis of all of that. You know why we always feel homesick? Wherever I've lived, when I grew up in Minnesota, it still didn't feel ultimately like home. And now I moved to Nashville, and it didn't feel ultimately like home. And then we left for California. That's felt the most home than anywhere we've lived, but it still wasn't home. And then Atlanta, and that wasn't home. And Bowling Green, we love it there. But we always have a degree of homesickness. That's ultimately only going to be answered when we get to be with the God of all comfort, the light of the world, the good shepherd, the refuge for the oppressed, the perfect Father, the God of peace, the God of grace, the one who is our Redeemer. All of the descriptions of God could be summed up in one way or another with love. All the light that's shining through these windows right now, all the light emanates from the sun. And in like manner, any love you've ever experienced in life has in one way or another originated from Jesus. Every time a brother or sister in Christ has done a good deed for you, where did they get that idea? From Jesus, who first loved them. And so we live in this world where we get a little taste of where we're going. Do you remember in the wilderness how God gave them manna? What did manna taste like? Tasted like honey. Where were they going? To a land flowing with milk and honey. It was like God was dropping a taste of where they were going. We get a little taste of where we're going. But do those little tastes make you want more and more and more? We get to be with the God face to face who loves us like that. But it's not just that we're with the Lord. This text also says that we're going to be with one another. It talks about the dead will rise, we who are alive. Notice how it uses we, the dead, like individuals still maintain their individuality. In the pantheistic religion and the idea that your ashes are going to be spread and it's going to feed a tree, you stop being you forever. But in the biblical worldview, you never stop being you. You're not a dewdrop going back to the ocean. You always get to maintain your identity, but in a perfected state with all the brethren who've gone on. You know, sometimes people will say, if we can't get along on earth, how are we going to get along in heaven? And the truth is, we're never going to get along perfectly on earth, brethren. We're never going to totally perfectly get along with each other. Love on earth is always agonizing. We want to be loved for our own sake. Have you ever met that person that was just trying to network and just trying to use you, and they acted like they loved you to try to use you as a stepping stone for something else? That's agonizing. That hurts. Have you ever loved somebody and they didn't love you back? Like, we want love to be mutual. We want to be able to love somebody and then they feel the same way, and we can have this kind of connection and friendship with each other, or even romantic relationship with each other. We want loved ones to be happy. I'll never forget, before our first one was born, there's a woman at the church in California, Lisa Adams, who said, as soon as that child is born, your heart will never fully be yours anymore. And so you can only be as happy as the people that you love. And if they're sad, you're sad. If they're happy, you're happy. And you're putting a lot of eggs in other people's baskets, and love is agonizing because these things happen to other people. We want to be able to love people without ever having to say goodbye. Some of the most difficult moments in my life has been when we're moving and it's the last Sunday or the last Wednesday at a church. You know what the Bible teaches, though? Is that we're going to be loving each other in a perfected way. It's going to be mutual love. We're all going to be happy all the time. There's not ever going to be a time that we have to say goodbye to one another. And all of this is because Jesus rose from the dead. what other worldview allows you to have the hope of not just existing? What people want after they die is they don't want to just exist. The Bible teaches that there's consciousness in hell. It's not like we want to keep having consciousness. It's that we want to be loved after we're dead. And this is what the Bible promises. The God from whom all love emanates will transform every one of us to be perfect and lovingly perfect, and to show people the kind of love that we were never able to fully do in this life. And we're going to be with each other forever. We all need a sense of hope, to have any way of managing the here and now. It can be a trite statement sometimes when somebody's going through something really difficult and go, everything's going to be okay. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes the cancer is going to keep growing and you're going to die. Sometimes the disease is going to get worse and you're not going to make it. But it's not trite for the Christian to say, in one sense, everything will be okay. It's not trite. It's true. Everything ultimately is going to be okay because Jesus rose from the dead. And if you're a secular person, everything will not be okay. Do you see how Jesus matches and meets our deepest needs? Do you see how we have such a treasure of a message? And there are people all around us that are having things stolen and killed and destroyed from them. And here we are with this precious message. And if we can discern that people have got emotional reasons for their unbelief, we can say, look, what's going to happen to you when you die? Have you at least considered what the biblical approach is to how it matches the deepest needs that you have to live with hope? At least consider it. Maybe you're here this morning and your hope is not really in Christ. Maybe you have been hoping that you're going to leave the world a better place. And maybe you will for some people for a little while. Maybe your hope is that when I die, I get to feed a tree. Your sights are set way too low. God has so much more for you. If there's anything that we can do for you this morning, this is an opportunity to get your life right with God. I appreciate very much the good dialogue that we've been able to have through these things. If anybody has any further comments or questions or anything they want to talk about, I'll send you all the notes that I have on these things. But thank you so much for the good time together. But if there's anybody here that needs any help, please come forward while we stand, while we sing.